For the time being, I'd just like to say welcome to UPTEC, the University of Portugal Science and Technology Park. Enjoy the ride, future places. We'll make it to Saturday somehow, and we'll be happy, I guarantee you. Without further ado, Nuno will say a few words.
Hey, good morning everyone. So just welcome you to the doctoral symposium. We have been organizing this for several years now, along with future places. And it's opportunity for everyone to show what people are doing and to discuss. So we just hope that there are many questions today and many comments about the work that is being presented. So there are students that are starting, students that are close to finish, and students that have ex-students that have already finished. So there are different experiences. So we just invite you all to talk to each other during the talks and afterwards. It's an opportunity for everyone to talk. I'm not going to talk much more about the program, so the doctoral program is just one part. Then there's the research projects, which is another big part, and the events like future places. And today we'll more or less combine all of these in this event, where some of you are doing projects, and we are also involved in future places. So just welcome you, and I will just ask Sharon to say a few words and introduce Chris as well.
Well, good morning again, and it's really a pleasure to look out and see so many familiar faces, and to know that so many of you are as interested as we are in this sort of subject matter. As Nuno and Heitor said, we've had both Future Places and the Doctoral Symposium for several years now, and both have somewhat different missions, but they're related. These are events within the digital media program of this grand collaboration between UT Austin and several universities here in Portugal. And indeed, I wanted to take this opportunity to let you know that the University of Madeira and the program that Chris is from, the Interactive Technologies Institute at Madeira, is also part of the program now, and we are looking forward to having more events and opportunities to work with the faculty and the graduate students at Madeira, so that we'll be an even bigger and more resourceful group of people investigating all sorts of things going on in this fascinating and evolving field of digital media. We will be continuing to do many of the things that we normally do throughout the year, and maybe there'll be some new sorts of events as well to bring us together and to foster more research and our various scholarly inquiries here. So I'm looking forward to today and the remainder of the week, and I'll invite you to, if you're interested in what's going on in Madeira, to please talk with Chris. He'll only be here today. So he's got a small window, but feel free to buttonhole him afterwards if you are interested in what's going on at that university. We're very pleased to have Chris do the opening keynote here. Chris Csikszentmihalyi has had an amazing career doing a lot of projects and a lot of research focused on a theme that has always been central to Future Places, and that is using technologies for civic engagement, for somehow doing social good. And I know many of the people in this room have been exploring different ways to affect social good, and I think the sorts of things that Chris will talk about today will be, at minimum, inspiring. And I'm really looking forward to the keynote. The remainder of the day, of course, is devoted to hearing what you've been working on, and I think all of the faculty and your colleagues here will be lively correspondents during the day. So, looking forward to this, and and I'll introduce Chris.
Thank you.
Heitor, Nuno, and Sharon, it's really nice to be part of this new configuration. Well, I mean, this is an eight-year-old configuration, but not for us at Madeira. So let me just pull this back. Great. It should have worked. There we go. Okay. That should. one slide off. Okay, so I liked this idea of media and the social fabric, and I have to say that this wasn't my original path. I was involved much more in a discourse around product design, speculative design, and as well art. My trajectory was a little odd in that I became interested in design, really coming from the social sciences, a college dropout. But I ended up working for a design company, and as I became more and more involved in this kind of design and technology world, I began to realize that, among other things, technology was a form of politics, but it was a non-democratic form of politics. A little bit like they say what armies are a language, or no, nations are a language with an army. In a sense, technologies are an army that typically serve the interest of corporations, sometimes governments. And so what I'm going to be talking about is kind of this relationship of design, product, and community, and trying to maybe find a way forward where we can have a material culture, kind of a world of information and things that we're designing, but we don't have to entrust the production and the distribution of those things entirely to some very rich people who are motivated by profit. You know, just to say, this is kind of the idea of product design. It looks a little bit like a Marvel comic book, and not completely coincidentally, it's this idea that somehow, you know, there are these things that really creative people produce. You know, they're kind of children of the mind between a pen, a vision, and an individual. But in fact, empirically, that's really nothing like how technology is made or produced. Bruno Latour is a great touch point, and he makes the argument that technology is society made durable. So essentially, technologies, you know, you expect in Anthropology 101 that when you go to a culture, the things that the culture uses, the pottery, the textiles, reflect aspects of that culture. Latour makes the argument that despite our urge to logic and empiricism and things like that, our technology is just as much a reflection of our culture as that of anywhere in the world, and that technology isn't de novo. It's not being produced in some kind of Platonic dimension where, you know, science discovers things and then technologists, through some bizarre process, take that science and turn it into technologies. But rather, technology is simply reifying or recreating technological social linkages that existed before its creation, and the enterprise is repeating it. And of course, there are moments of potential intervention. So Chris Kelty, in his really fantastic overview of the free software movement, history of the free software movement called 2 Bits, makes an argument that there's a slightly, not necessarily different process by which geeks reproduce technologies as a way of producing a public that they would like to live in. And so he calls this the idea of a recursive public. So you have geeks who are communicating online. While they're communicating online, they say, wouldn't the tools of communication better work this way, or wouldn't it be better to kind of have these things happen? And they create those tools, and then they communicate through those new kind of instantiations. And so Kelty makes an argument that geeks are doing this, and because geeks are a subculture, the effect of this can be a little bit different than what's produced in the mainstream culture. And so Kelty points to the example of free software, you know, which was in some ways the reaction of Richard Stallman to a kind of a corporate takeover of computing, and trying to reassert sort of the rights that he felt as a scholar and kind of independent coder he should take back. But you know, it's hard to describe the problems that Richard Stallman and Chris Kelty are addressing, that free software was trying to cure, unless you understand a little bit of that kind of corporate path better. So in product design, the kind of holy grail, one of a couple of holy grails, is to develop a water bottle or a container. In a sense, containers are really important to product design because you're often, as a product designer, not brought in until the last possible moment, and so really all you get to do is the container. But in a sense, this infects our way of thinking, and so here I am drinking out of a water bottle, but the product of the water bottle is, an entire process that goes long, long beyond the container. And it's not just a process that stops at things like junk or the purity of the water inside the bottle. It's a process that also occludes possibilities. So, for instance, I was in India about 7-8 years ago when bottled water was being drunk very much by the kind of rising middle class in India. And what was happening is these Indians who had never stepped foot outside of Delhi or Bangalore were suddenly developing the kinds of stomach ailments that we as Europeans or North Americans get when we travel to India. And the reason is because they were drinking this bottled water, but then they would eat some vegetables that had been washed with non-bottled water, and their dependency of the bottled water had grown so much that they were no longer able to resist the microbes in their local environment. So this isn't part of the Dasani plan, right? I mean, this is a completely secondary effect, but it's a secondary effect that affects any Indian who's made the choice to kind of privately invest in water quality. And of course, the contrast to this is completely unsexy. It's something that the Romans kind of understood. It's public water supplies, and but who gets into civil engineering these days? It's it's just not. It's not the hot thing. It's not coming from Silicon Valley. So, but the flip side of the water bottle problem is that when the richest people in a society are taken care of because they can invest in water bottles, they stop being that interested in the public water supply. And so globally, we're seeing really radical, fast declines in the quality of public water supply because elites are no longer using the public water supply. And so, it's becoming an issue of something more like public transportation rather than something that everyone has to use. And this kind of contrast, is a huge thing in the US. It's a huge thing where I come from with technology because, unfortunately, technology and libertarianism are really closely identified with each other in the States. And so around 2007, I started a center at MIT called the Center for Civic Media with Henry Jenkins and Mitch Resnick, which was really trying to say, can we get beyond this kind of question of neoliberal and libertarian tendencies in technology and think about technologies that are a little bit more like the public water supply, that are a little bit more civic-minded, a little bit more around public engagement, and less oriented towards empowering individuals, which unfortunately almost every technology is really focused on. But of course, yeah, public water supplies are still not sexy enough, so we didn't ever really work in those. But we did work in other areas. So, again, this is a product, and if you do public opinion surveys in North America of what products are made by machines or robots, and what products are made by people, almost everyone thinks these products are made by robots. And none of them are. Every piece of clothing that everyone here is wearing, I almost guarantee it, is, unless you've got some really fantastic high-end custom stuff from northern Italy, is made in situations like this. And yet we can never know that. I mean, we might see made in India, made in Haiti on a label, but that's really the extent of what we understand about where our material culture is coming from. And in fact, it's not so simple. I mean, this is just one of the last stages of sewing together a t-shirt. The actual places where things come from are much more complex and woven in our global society. So this, for instance, is the work that one of my students did in a class. Leo Bonanni was trying to understand where his laptop came from. This is from the mid-2000s. A lot of people were doing this. A variety of books were published, tracking a fish from where it was spawned until where it ends up in our table at lunch today. But as he was doing it, he started thinking, okay, So I can do this with my laptop. It took him a little over a year till he had, I think, like 95% of the parts identified. But he was interested both in the fact that IBM, Lenovo was not making this an easy process. So they were systematically kind of erasing where things came from and what the communities of origin were for different parts and where the materials were coming from. And he also, I think, was just horrified by the process because he knew a lot of designers at places like Lenovo. We have audio here, by the way. There's audio on this one. So it's not pleasant audio. I didn't say it was pleasant, but this is Bangka, Indonesia, where about 80% of the world's tin comes from, and this is how tin is mined. It's called artisanal mining, like artisanal goat cheese, but it means standing in mud up to your chin all day long. And the heaviest element of the electronics in your phone or your laptop is tin, and it comes from kind of a situation like this. So, we're carrying these essentially mute objects. We're carrying these things that have no way to tell their own story. And so he decided to try to abstract that and built a platform for doing this kind of work. And it's called SourceMap. It was initially an open platform. The open platform is suffering a little bit because Matt Hockenberry, his partner, went to get a PhD. Always a bad idea. So Leo took on the for-profit side, and the nonprofit side is languishing a little bit. But this shows upstream is blue, downstream is yellow, basically, and it kind of goes through that palette, and you can see where the raw materials are coming from. This is toothpaste, but a very kind of global idea of toothpaste, and most products that we touch are like that. So essentially, by building the platform, what Leo was trying to do is to make it a little bit easier for people to start to collaborate on the research, because for one person to look at a laptop is very complicated, both for 10 people who work in factories to contribute what they know in the factory, for some people who study mining or resource management, putting some information in would be fairly easy because they understand that part of the supply chain. And so SourceMap was basically a way to build a software platform, a little bit like Wikipedia or OpenStreetMap, to begin to understand how communities of consumption were linked, or individual consumers were linked to communities of production. And there were some really great things that happened along the way. For instance, the Carbon Trust approached us because they said, well, we have information about the carbon values of producing this kind of material. What if you were to integrate that? And so this became very quickly the really best and possibly only tool for beginning to, as a designer, understand the carbon implications, for instance, of your material choices. And so journalists were using this, environmentalists were using this, designers were using this, all as a way to begin to understand those relationships. But that's the thing, is that infrastructure is hidden. In some cases, it's hidden because you don't want to see it as you're walking down the street. In other cases, it's hidden because companies don't want you necessarily to follow these supply chains. And one of the things that Leo really learned very quickly was that there was always this mixture. It wasn't absolutely clear. Companies didn't want you necessarily to know their supply chain. But then there were other companies like Nike who had been so destroyed by news about their sweatshop practices that they developed the world's most transparent supply chain. The problem is that their supply chain, when they were discovered in the 1990s and became this kind of pariah, corporate pariah, was really not that different from any of their competitors. Yet they were the ones who were kind of targeted because they were the biggest. So Nike was one of the first buyers into the SourceMap company because they wanted to basically nail all their competitors the way they had been nailed by human rights activists. So it was a very interesting kind of process. The other thing he learned is that, I don't know how many of you are familiar with SAP, but it runs something like 80% of global corporate accounting. It's this huge, huge monopoly in corporate accounting. they have no understanding of supply chain in their system. So what they have is billing addresses. And so when something like Fukushima happened, the tsunami and the nuclear, kind of horrifying nuclear catastrophe, all these global supply chains were disrupted. But it's not that anyone didn't want to know the supply chain in the corporations themselves. It's that simply they didn't know the supply chain because all they really had to do was make sure that checks were being issued and products were being shipped. And so they had those addresses on file, but they didn't have the addresses of where things were coming from. So it's something of a global conspiracy, but it's also not, because people are just too busy to kind of learn about it. And in other cases, infrastructure is like completely hidden until some short, sharp shock happens. So this is, for instance, the earthquake in Haiti, where there were building codes, there were ways you were supposed to build building, the right ratio of sand to water to concrete, but no one was doing it and no one was inspecting it. And so you'll see an earthquake in Chile, for instance, in an equal population to an earthquake in Turkey will have dramatically different impacts because of this kind of quiet infrastructure that's happening about enforcement, about legislation, et cetera. So kind of to take a step into the kind of current decade, what's the technology, what's the app that's kind of the most interesting in terms of space? I have to say it's probably Uber is the one that's the most discussed, and this gives us a great chance to kind of look at what's pushing Uber and how it's potentially changing communities. So I went to Uber from my hotel, and this is what I got. Go Portugal. But it's imbricated in a kind of a new relationship between labor, place, and technology. And Tim O'Reilly, this kind of what Evgeny Morozov calls him the meme hustler, has described as the what the fuck economy. And his point is, what the fuck, in San Francisco, Uber has 3 times the revenue of the entire prior taxi and limousine industry. And so O'Reilly is trying to make the argument that Uber is amazing because it's creating revenue. It's not just replacing an old business model, but it's creating new opportunities for people. And goes on to talk about Airbnb and these other kind of aspects of essentially what are low infrastructure, information-based companies that rely on people to trade, I don't even want to say to share their resources. And you know, it's interesting to look at, but it's also interesting to actually look at Tim O'Reilly's language from that same article. And I know Tim very well. I've been to his house a couple times, and I'm good friends with his daughter. But this is, I think, a really telling kind of example of language. He says we need to ask ourselves the fundamental social safety nets of the developed world, whether they will survive the transition, and more importantly, what will we replace them with? And you know, this may be an English speaker's attention to nuance, a native English speaker's attention to nuance, but it's sort of the equivalent of, I don't know if my grandfather's about to die, but more importantly, I need to figure out where I'm going to bury him now. You know, it's this very strange kind of formulation, which is saying, well, maybe the safety nets will survive or not, but most importantly, we have to replace them. So it's a very kind of strange question, but it's really a neoliberalism at its face, and this is someone who's considered less neoliberal than the competition. So it's a kind of a strange position, and scholars like Zeynep Tufekci have basically pointed out that the reason that people are so concerned about Uber isn't necessarily that it's threatening taxi driving or walking or taking buses or things like that. It's that the labor model is so tremendously problematic, that these the socio-technical system, this app, on the face it looks like an app, is actually doing so much more than simply finding transportation. It's putting us in a relationship between labor and money and information and autonomy that looks very, very slippery and very dangerous to all of us. And we recognize it in Uber because it's actually something that's happening to all of us in subtle ways all the time. So Zeynep Tufekci basically makes the argument that most of us are working jobs that really should be 1.5 to 2.5 people's worth of work. And that's simply because we're now available by email at home. We have these increasingly fluid practices of having to answer cell phones when we're walking. Work has basically intruded into so many more parts of our lives than it would have been historically. And of course, this tension, this concern is constant. It's never stopped. But I think the question is, in what ways are we imbricated? And how, where are we imbricated, and how that works. So I, saw these buses in Porto the other day, and I don't know, how many of you have ridden one of these natural gas buses? Yeah, okay, a bunch. Sounds great. Natural gas, of course, is not a chemical term. It was a term created by industry as part of a branding exercise, kind of like ethnic cleansing. There's nothing natural about gas. This is, in fact, where Sharon is living. This is Texas. And when I was flying over, I thought, oh, okay, these are trailers, these are suburban houses. But in fact, they're not. This is where natural gas comes from. Each of those is a well pad, an oil or gas well pad. I think these ones are gas, but I'm not 100% sure. And the relationship of information is really interesting in each of these well pads. I showed the Modern Times image because I was talking about where are we imbricated in this kind of global business and production. And the interesting thing about Texas is that you can own property, and it might have been in your family for 100, 150 years. And an oil company can come and start drilling on your property without your permission. And I just want to point out, this is in the United States, where presumably we have legal recourse, we have a fairly functioning political system, we have a very high-functioning tort and liability system. Everyone's suing everyone for everything, but this is still legal. This is work that we were doing through Civic Media for about 3 or 4 years, basically trying to put activists on the ground in rural parts of the United States that were facing oil and gas extraction, putting them together in ways to essentially create unions, or we couldn't call them unions in this part of the country, I should point out, but basically creating organizations, social movements to resist fracking and resist this kind of global incursion. Now, at the same time this was happening, water mains were breaking around New York City, and bridges were falling down in Minnesota, sorry, and there was this big American argument about our infrastructure is failing. But all this infrastructure had been built in the previous 10, 15 years or so. And so what you're seeing is individual well pads now within this area. We knew a guy who was a goat farmer who had 40 acres, and he had 40 wells on his property. Every single inch of his topsoil had been basically erased, moved, which in the West it takes between 70 and 120 years for topsoil to recover to the point where you can grow something. So these are kind of amazing. These are huge, football field-sized pits where they're evaporating material, liquid, fracking fluid it's called, and water that's pulled up, contaminated water that's pulled up in the process of drilling for our natural gas buses. Just want to bring it back. And the reason that they're evaporating this, they actually have huge fountains that go up 30 meters in the air to help evaporate. It's because it's illegal to transport these on the highway system because they're too toxic. So they just evaporate them. And so we know people who would get to their home over here, walk out of their truck, and then pass out because of hydrogen sulfide poisoning. It's just incredible how the landscape changes. And none of these people want this to happen on their property. They have no recourse to prevent it. So many of them become activists for 10 or 15 years. They might win a lawsuit, at which point they move somewhere else, and they usually have to sign a non-disclosure agreement. So even the terms by which they're allowed to speak about their experiences are dictated by this crazy finance of what global capital can do when it moves into a community. So I guess the point is, like as with Uber, as with our kind of always-on email culture, these people are not choosing to be part of this economy. They're not choosing to be part of this production process. They have no choice. In the US, you can imagine in the Niger Delta or in Indonesia what that system looks like. So some of the systems that we built, we worked with anthropologists to better understand what are important critical junctures at which your life can change because of this global extraction industry. One of them is when a landman, who's essentially a salesman of the company, comes to your door. So we built a Yelp system to rate landmen, which immediately generated a lot of lawsuits. As well as wikis where we would take state databases that are really contracts between the production company and the state. The state's trying to help the production company, but they need to know where the wells are. But only those two actors can contribute to the database. So we would basically scrape the database, create a wiki where people who lived with a well next to them could upload their experiences. And so this is one county in Colorado just showing illegal disposal, really severe skin diseases that were, epidemiologists were just beginning to look into in a 20-year process. So behind all of this work is this question of, what are the precedents? And for us, we were always thinking about newspapers as this very important kind of community information platform that had many great affordances, many problems. In the US, the problem is that they're all going out of business. But for a while, that's been the case. And so we had another problem, which was that there was only one newspaper left, or maybe two in a community, whereas in fact, you need a lot more. And so one way to kind of think about the difference between newspapers and kind of contemporary information systems is, are they acting as a common carrier? Are they accessible to everyone? And as we were doing this work, thinking about communities and information, one of my students pointed out that 1% of Americans are in an involuntary community, something like a retirement community, but which is prison, highest incarceration rate in the developed world. And you see really interesting kind of informational processes playing out in prisons. One of which is that it costs about $1 a minute to call a prison, let alone try to call out. So basically these kind of strange monopolies. So moreover, prisoners in the US are almost entirely not allowed to touch the internet. And this became very interesting for us because, thinking about, say, the civil rights movement, it was very important for prominent African Americans to write editorials, for women to, hold teach-ins. And, it's really important for people to be able to self-advocate and to tell their story to the public. It's a very important part of how social movements work. So my student started thinking, what if we could allow prisoners to blog, and created, this is Charles Datar's work, Between the Bars. It's essentially a blogging engine for prisoners. And we launched it, and we had to go through about 1.5 years of campus human subject review before they would allow us to launch it. Within 3 months, our human subject contract was revoked by MIT because the state of New York was suing us because they hated it. But it's a very kind of interesting example of creating an information system in a place where, it should technically not be possible, but prisoners are allowed to send letters. So basically what we did is we, again, took this kind of federated software platform model and allowed people to send letters to the families of prisoners who would then scan them, upload them, and then strangers on the internet would start to transcribe them so that they would be Google searchable, and the text would be kind of accessible in an electronic way. People can leave comments on the blog, which are then printed out every week and sent back to the prisoners. And so you get these exchanges, long exchanges back and forth. This is one that I really love. I mentioned it as kind of the moment when I knew the system was working. This is a corporal who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan who had PTSD, got into a bar fight, put a couple people in the hospital, and is in jail for 15 years. He was just writing a single blog post where he was basically imploring other veterans to get psychologically evaluated. Because he said, I was sick, I had PTSD, I didn't mean to hurt those people, I'll regret that for the rest of my life, and much of the rest of my life will be in prison, so please get checked out. And that was it. He thought he was going to write one blog post. But after about 4 or 5 months, some of his former, he was a sergeant, no, I'm trying to remember if he was a colonel or sergeant, but some of the people started writing and saying, you were the best officer, I was going to commit suicide, you talked me out of it. All these people were just basically writing saying, you changed my life. And they created this whole support group, visited him in prison, offered him work and jobs after he got out. Exactly the opposite of what's the problem with prison right now. And so that to us was a really good sign that this information platform was actually working to build kind of strong social ties, even in a virtual way. This is all art that prisoners have sent and scanned. Don't ask me. But the best, and just really, betweenthebars.org, check it out. There's about 700 prisoners blogging actively. The recipes are really worth trying to recreate, recipes of need. So, last project, I think I'm probably going to end right on time without questions, but I gradually became more and more interested in the ways that, say, the development community was working around information technology. So this was really the first time I got involved was after the earthquake in Haiti. There was a big push in the technology community to develop systems to kind of support aid workers, to think through what the communication systems in Haiti had been before and what would be necessary after this earthquake that killed 250,000 people. And so we were experimenting, doing things. It was perhaps a little bit arrogant to think that we could move in and actually produce a difference. Studies that were commissioned by the Knight Foundation after the fact pointed out that there were some very interesting things that happened. What often happens is an emergency like this, the technology is developed that gets used in the next emergency. And that's been the case post the Haiti earthquake. But Knight, the commissioners of Knight pointed out that actually it was radio that made the biggest difference. It was this very old media that made the biggest difference. So the phone networks were down, hospitals were gone, but there were a couple of radio stations that survived, and they became very, very important. And so I started thinking through the fact that none of us in the tech community had thought about radio. Thinking through the fact that people in an emergency will tend to use the media that they used before the emergency, that they trust. And so the idea that you can come in after the fact is kind of problematic. But moreover, I began to realize that there is a strange model in development communications, which is that users essentially don't get to use the systems because the systems aren't actually being built for people, they're being built for NGOs and development agencies. And that was totally the case in the Haiti earthquake tech response. So this is an example of a real system that's out in the world where basically babies get born, health workers register it with the system sends reminders to the mothers about child health, and then health workers come to the mothers and explain it to them. And what's kind of amazing about this is that neither the health workers nor the mothers can use this in any way like a common carrier, like a general information system. So all of their creativity, all of their knowledge, local knowledge of what's going on the ground is systematically pulled out of the system, which is really a top-down system built on the business model of the NGO that's serving them. And I wanted to contrast that to, this is the computer lab in Makerere University. And when you go in there, there's lots of students using the computers in Kampala, Uganda, and they're all on Facebook. And the crazy thing about Facebook is that, so this is my Facebook stream, and this is my collaborator Jude Mukandane's Facebook stream. They're completely different, but the interface is exactly the same. The software is exactly the same. In a sense, what Facebook is doing, and I hate to say this, it makes me physically ill, it's acting in a way like a common carrier. It's basically allowing people to send the messages that are important to them to people who are part of their network. And as a result, everything that's happening within Facebook looks completely different from a Ugandan, in fact, a very particular type of Ugandan to me. And so I find that's very kind of confusing and strange. But it does point out a really strong advantage of building software platforms. So thinking about this and thinking about how information technologies work in the developed world, I started looking at radio and how we could essentially reformulate radio. It's a very complicated space. I've been working in Uganda for about 3.5 years now, and we're running 4 radio stations that are so far very successful. We're looking at a country with 33 million people where 100,000 newspapers are printed each week, all the newspapers combined. So essentially, text is not an information platform by which people get news. Radio is, but radio's also problematic in that the radio stations are private, they're commercial, they're owned by ministers of churches, ministers of parliament, and businessmen. There's kind of no public radio to speak of. These are some of the stations. They have really great wallpaper. Like all of them have really great flocked wallpaper because it's the acoustic properties are good. But and this is how those stations work. Essentially, in the kind of 20th century broadcast model, if a station is successful, it gets bigger, it gets more people, it sells more expensive advertising, it increases its transmitter, becomes bigger, and not to put too fine a point on it, people become smaller in comparison. And so in order to keep the radio station sounding like it's within the community or sounding like it's grounded, you have these human voices which are very successful at broadcasting kind of a sense that you're connected to the radio somehow because we connect to people very easily. But in fact, and you have call-in shows, which are really 80% of the shows in sub-Saharan Africa. But I think the scale is wrong. And so basically what we're trying to do, and again, it's a little bit arrogant, is we're trying to look at what is the scale that works. So this is how buses work in Uganda. These are pretty much, this is the bus stop that you go to. And this is the most common form of transportation are these things called boda-bodas, which are very low infrastructural investment, very easy to fix, and they can be used to transport things that you wouldn't imagine could be transported. And people laugh, and sometimes it's very funny. Even Ugandans laugh, so it's okay to laugh. But what's more importantly is understanding the economics and the flexibility of these systems. And so we've been basically trying to understand the relationship between radio and listeners. So this, for instance, is a station in Nebi, Uganda. I went to visit a station in Nebi, Uganda, and then I started driving around the villages near this station. This is 7 kilometers away from the transmission tower, and I was asking these farmers, do you listen to this radio station, which was well known because it was a farmer's radio station. And it was all about agriculture. And so I went to these farmers and I said, do you listen to this famous radio station that all the NGOs are writing about? And they said, no. And I said, why? And they said, because, well, the farmers are very different from us on that radio station. I was thinking, 7 kilometers, are they in bottomland? And, or is there something very strange about how they're farming? But it turns out that the farmers who call the radio station are cotton farmers. They're very highly capitalized because the cost of calling a radio station is so high that you only do it if you've got a lot of extra capital. And so while there's ostensibly this kind of community information platform side of radio stations in Uganda, in fact, it's really the top 0.1% who are participating and whose stories are getting told and whose questions are being answered on the radio. And it's a structural problem about ownership. So we basically hypothesized that we could create a station that was very small. It basically uses a very cheap transmitter and a cell phone. And we're adding the cloud because, that's what you do. It's 2015. But what the cloud does is allow us to essentially call the smartphone. It's basically the headphone jack of the smartphone is connected to the transmitter. It's very simple. The phone can answer a call from a number that it knows and recognizes and basically play the audio through, just like a conference call, like a speakerphone, essentially. Except that it's being broadcast about 15 kilometers in most directions from the radio station. And what that means is that at no cost to the station, because the outgoing call is who's paying, the station costs nothing to receive the call, it essentially allows us to broadcast unlimited audio at no cost to the station. So very quickly, you can see that you can essentially create conference calls where we call a host, and then we call the station, and we bridge them together in a conference call. And essentially, you have someone anywhere in the world being able to host a call on the station again, with no cost to the station to broadcast. And very quickly, that can get more complicated. The host can give a cloud-based phone number. People can call that phone number. The host can bring them in just using its touch tone, and essentially create more or less every kind of show that you have on radio. And the goal is not to let that station get bigger, but rather to proliferate stations. Say, let's have a station for every 10,000 people or so. And that way, local languages can be used in the broadcast. You can consolidate when it comes to national news. Studios no longer look like this, but instead people can kind of answer the phone anywhere they're working. And then you bring the economy down, the economics of the station down to the point where someone, a very small local business person, can essentially record an advertisement on that station for the local economic cost, which is just a few cents. And so we have people now recording greetings, funeral announcements, things like that. Just to show you really quickly, the app is available in the Google Play Store. These are the locally produced stations, which we're putting in waterproof buckets, essentially. These are locally produced antennas. So there's a small business now producing antennas for the stations. This is Pabo, my favorite of the stations. This is kind of, you can get a sense of how far it broadcasts because FM is line of sight. So more or less where you see the tree line in the horizon is as far as you can hear it. That's just local color. So that's pretty much it. This is, we've got some audio here. This is getting the first station in Pabo online, and really good parties at the openings. So I think this was me. This is a cathartic dance of the Mzungu, the white guy coming. But so the stations have been running now for about, well, since June 1st or so, uninterrupted. And this is Pabo, again, my favorite station. You could turn it up a little. These are the shows that are currently being played. Weekend Connection, Business Focus, sports shows, devotion shows, et cetera, that are all being produced within about 10 kilometers of the station by people who are essentially not being paid, but they're figuring out how to parlay a show into opportunities for themselves and others and things like that. So anyway, that's it. I guess I would just close. Someone was maligning Yochai Benkler last night. I'd close by saying that what we're trying to do is look at kind of current technology shifts and then figure out, can we renegotiate kind of the means of communication in communities and social movements in ways that are possible. And I would make an argument, just to reiterate from Benkler, that there does seem to be a possibility for these collaborative processes to work. When we first went to Uganda, everyone said, someone needs to be making money off of those stations. It's not going to work unless someone makes money off of them. In a society which has a lot of aspects of commons-based politics and production and ownership. So for us, it was very interesting that we were kind of like new colonists of peer production and trying to make up for the last 200 years of colonialism, saying, oh no, it's got to be about markets and liberalism. But we are in this moment where you can renegotiate some of these things, and it's a really fun process to do. So thank you very much.
We have time for questions, do we not, Aitor?
Do we?
Aitor, good. Let's take some time for questions.
I have a functional question. I'm trying to find examples that you're pointing at, Google and search them, and you can't seem to reach them.
Sourcemap.com. Betweenthebars.org. Okay.
Anti-fracking movement, law, the wiki.
Sorry, the what?
Wiki of anti-fracking.
Those are no longer active. Unfortunately. Yeah, we can talk about why, but the center at MIT, I left the center, and about 2 years later, those projects more or less stopped. So those are not successful examples, I would say. But I was giving them more about the imbrication. But I have to say that in the end, we failed in that case to create a system that perpetuated itself. And there are a couple of reasons, but one of them is simply that, you know, of the initial 5 people that I was working with, 2 have died, one of pituitary cancer, which is very, very rare, only kind of happens in extreme pollution situations. Many of them have had to sign those non-disclosure agreements. And so it's a very tough situation in which to make change, I will say. Some of the work that we did is continuing in one form or another, but that's not one that is continuing. Others?
Sorry?
Were there others that you were trying to find?
Other radio station, the whole...
So that's rutio.org.
Ruti?
Rutio.org. If you code, the GitHub is like absolutely one of the better ways to look at it. But you can just do a Google search for Rootio, R-O-O-T-I-O radio, and you'll find some stuff. Yeah.
Microphone. Thank you, Chris. Thank you for a very informative talk. I'm interested in understanding how some of these projects may translate into distinct environments. One of the concerns that we've been operating on in Future Places throughout the years is the belief that certain aspects of these new technologies and challenges, they actually operate very differently in different contexts that correspond to fundamentally different social fabrics with different kinds of historical habits and networks. So let's take this radio example. Part of the work that we've been doing here is also developing community radio. How much, in your experience, do you think is maybe translatable or used as a template out of Uganda into other places? Or how much of it is actually woven into the culture that has certain means of participation and doesn't necessarily occur like that in other places, such as Portugal, for example?
So, I mean, it's a great question, and this is, this was always one of the, I mean, I don't think we solved it at the Civic Media Center. It was something that we were discussing constantly. I guess, you know, that's what I was trying to say about the Facebook platform, you know, is just that its international success is astounding and terrifying. You know, and it's terrifying in part because I believe so much in local knowledge, but I think that's what Facebook has managed to do, is to say, no, there's local knowledge there. I mean, you know, these people are people that you know already in most cases, or friends of people that you know, and they're contributing what they can. Now, you know, I presented this and you know, some of the people in the audience at one point were Danish, and they were making an argument that in Facebook you still can't really type in Danish correctly. Right, so I'm not by any means endorsing Facebook or saying that you know, it is honoring local culture, but I think the thing about Uganda that we're trying to point to is of the media that's available, those 100,000 newspapers per week and 33 million people, there are only a few languages that newspapers are being published in. For the radio stations, there's probably about 15 languages that are commonly spoken on radio in Uganda, which tend to be the biggest kind of linguistic groups. Again, 33 million people, 43 languages, according to Ethnologue. So one of the most linguistically diverse areas in the world, and most of those languages have no radio whatsoever. So I guess what I'm trying to say is it's not a question of absolutes. You know, we're, by choosing to do radio, we're obscuring certain cultural practices that won't get in electronic media, but voice will. But at the same time, we're also hopefully producing lifelines for languages that are, you know, facing extinction essentially, because electronic media is ubiquitous and it's all coming in Luganda, English, Swahili, a couple of other languages.
So I'll just further ask for clarification in your experience. Does this radio project operate fundamentally as a reflection of the social fabric that is already there? Or does it somehow foster the kinds of connections that need to be built? And I think in Portugal this is relevant because there is a lack of a tradition of civic involvement.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a fantastic question. Yes, I would hope it fosters some new modes. I mean, you know, like I said, if you're talking about the traditional fabric of Uganda, you know, talking about radio is kind of hilarious because radio was only liberalized in 1992, and you know, by 1998 there were, I think, 8 stations, and now there's about 120. But so, you know, we're already talking about a place that's completely imbricated in globalism, that has, you know, as you're driving to these remote stations, you're passing Chinese road crews where all the managers are, you know, directing Ugandans on where to pour the concrete and stuff like that. I mean, it's like, it's not as if this is an untouched, you know, culture that we're somehow the first to involve ourselves in. There's definitely an activist side to this, and I'll tell you, I started working in Uganda in part because they had just discovered oil in the Rift Valley, you know, this place that presumably humans started in, and it's just beautiful, and they're about to trash it completely. And so I started thinking, how can we bring some of the, you know, community organizing systems that we're trying to build in the US and the Western states? Is there any way to do something like that in Uganda? And I just began to realize, no, there isn't, because there's essentially no local media whatsoever. And so I was like, okay, you know, like, I'm an idiot. I'll try to build local media, you know, in a place where there really wasn't, you know, musically there's a local media culture, storytelling there's a local media culture, but not an activist one, not one that would allow different configurations of power. And so when we came there, we, you know, had to negotiate with the mayors, with the governors, et cetera, people who already owned radio stations, and they loved it because they know how to use radio, so they thought, oh, more power for us. But ultimately, to try to build this in a way that it is more commons owned, that it's hosted in community-based organizations that don't have ties to political power, et cetera. And so we're very activist in that initial instantiation. If this scales, Lord knows what will happen. I mean, like, I actually can't say, but the point is, it should take about as much to start a station as to buy one of those motorcycles. Like, that's what we're ultimately getting for. And if that's the case, then it's a much more open playing field than, you know, the big bus lines or an airline or something like that. So yeah, it's a great question. I don't know, you know, it really is aimed at relatively low income rural areas. There's a whole kind of question about regulation. Some countries like South Africa allow small stations like this to exist without being fully regulated. Portugal does not. So I've talked to Anacom. They say the last spectrum negotiation was 15 years ago, and there's not even plans for another one. You know, I think we need to work with the European Union to try to push what's been happening in France and England. You know, France made community radio legal, and there's now 350 stations in a period of like 5 years. They're subsidized in part by the government. We need to try to have Portugal change from the top down, I think. That's what Anacom says. They're like, please get the European Union to allow us to deregulate micropower radio. So I think that's what we have to do.
Can you say anything about how, so it's one thing to talk about a kind of commons-based peer production model, but can you say anything about how the commons-based peers were involved in the actual design process? So rather than sort of design it still exclusively in a kind of, you know, enclosed environment, to what extent are you actually engaging the commons in the actual design process?
Yeah, I mean, so again, I know that in the design community this is like heresy, but like almost not at all. I mean, you know, this project, Rutio, is a collaboration between myself and a computer scientist named Jude Mukundane who worked in the telco industry. Jude had been working for a variety of NGOs like UNICEF, their Tech for Development Lab and things like that. So I'd say first off that it's basically between two, you know, peers, one based in Uganda, one based outside. But you know, when you look at the electronic communications that are becoming really widespread in Uganda, there's no co-design involved whatsoever. You know, like the GSM system, the cell phone system, which now you see in rural areas. I mean, it's very unevenly distributed, but it's a very viable communications platform. Facebook, you know, none of these had any co-design whatsoever, and so we're really approaching it a little bit differently. And it's not to say that we didn't do a lot of field work and a lot of, you know, user testing and stuff like that, but we're really kind of taking seriously that if we want this to spread, we're going to have to act a little bit like Facebook, you know, which has one employee for every 250,000 people. You know, like they don't make any choices based on local community whatsoever. And so in a sense, we're, as painful as it is sometimes, we're sort of trying to channel that and to say, you know, what's the difference between us and all these development projects or design for development projects that never seem to spread. And part of it, we're arguing, it's a hypothesis, is that we're going to be coming in with a very different perspective than most co-design projects. I could tell along, if you have time afterwards, I'll tell you a story about when I got to MIT, I thought there's a co-design lab, the co-lab at MIT, and I thought these would be our natural allies. And we kept inviting each other, and we really loved each other, and in the end, we didn't work together at all, because we just had such different ideas about the step after the initial research and how things would spread. So it was very, I wasn't expecting that. I thought that we would be, you know, working together immediately. So it's probably good, right? We've probably gone on long enough. Thank you very much.